The little bookstore on Maple Avenue had stood for almost 20 years. Its wooden shelves were packed with old and new books, and a small bell above the door rang softly whenever someone walked in. The owner, Grace, a smart and determined young woman, had inherited the shop from her grandfather. She loved every corner of it, every dusty book, every creaky floorboard. That morning, the street outside was unusually quiet. A large black car parked directly in front of the store, its dark windows hiding whoever sat inside. Grace glanced up from behind the counter, curious but not yet worried. The door opened, and a tall, well-dressed man stepped inside. His suit was expensive, his shoes polished, his expression calm but intimidating. Behind him stood two large men, clearly bodyguards, positioning themselves near the entrance. Grace recognized him immediately, though she had never met him in person before. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the name Dante Russo. He was the man behind half the businesses on this street, though most people avoided speaking about how exactly he had gained control of so much property so quickly. "Good morning," Grace said politely, though she straightened slightly behind the counter, sensing this was not a simple visit. Dante looked around the small store slowly, his eyes moving across the shelves with mild disinterest. "Nice little shop," he said finally, his voice smooth and confident. "Shame it won't be here much longer." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me." "I'm buying this building," Dante said, walking closer to the counter. "Along with the rest of the block. I'm offering fair compensation for your lease, of course." "More than generous, actually." Grace crossed her arms calmly. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Russo. This store isn't for sale." Dante smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "I don't think you understand how this works. I'm not really asking permission. I'm informing you of what will happen." "And I'm informing you," Grace replied evenly, "that my grandfather signed a 50-year lease agreement with the original property owner long before you ever got involved in this neighborhood. That lease still has 23 years remaining, and it cannot be broken without my direct agreement." Dante's smile faltered slightly, clearly not expecting such a specific and confident response. "Leases can be renegotiated," he said, recovering quickly. "Especially when new owners take over a property." "Not this one," Grace said firmly. "I had our family lawyer review every detail years ago, specifically because I suspected someone like you might eventually come asking. The terms are airtight, Mr. Russo. No new owner can override it without my written consent." The two bodyguards near the door exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unused to seeing anyone speak to their boss with such calm confidence. Dante studied Grace closely now, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced with something more careful, more calculating. "You seem very prepared for this conversation. I've watched you push out 3 other businesses on this street over the past year," Grace said, her voice steady despite the tension building in the room. "I made sure I wouldn't be the 4th. Dante's jaw tightened slightly, clearly unaccustomed to having his plans questioned so directly. "Those other business owners saw reason eventually," he said, his tone hardening. "I would hate for this to become difficult, Grace." "Is that a threat?" Grace asked, her voice remaining calm despite her racing heart. "Simply a friendly warning," Dante said smoothly. "Buildings sometimes have problems. Fires, plumbing issues, insurance complications. Small businesses like yours often can't survive that kind of bad luck." Grace's expression did not change, though she noted every word carefully, understanding exactly what he was implying. "That sounds less like friendly advice and more like a criminal threat, Mr. Russo. Something I'm sure the police and my lawyer would find very interesting, especially recorded." She reached beneath the counter and placed a small object down, its light blinking steadily. Dante's eyes widened slightly. "Is that—" "A recording device," Grace confirmed calmly. "Started the moment you walked through my door. I run a business alone in a rough part of town, Mr. Russo. I learned a long time ago to protect myself carefully." For a brief moment, genuine surprise flickered across Dante's usually controlled expression. He had expected fear, hesitation, perhaps quick submission. Instead, he found himself facing someone entirely prepared for this confrontation. "You're bluffing," he said, though less confidently than before. "Try me," Grace replied simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. The tension in the small store grew thick, neither willing to back down first. Dante's bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, unsure how their boss intended to handle this unexpected resistance. Finally, Dante forced a tight smile, stepping back slightly. "You're an interesting woman, Grace," he said, his tone shifting to something more measured. "Most people don't argue with me twice." "I'm not most people," Grace replied evenly. "Clearly," Dante said, glancing briefly at the recording device still blinking steadily on the counter. "I'll be in touch." He turned and walked toward the door, his bodyguards following closely behind. Just before leaving, he paused, looking back at Grace one final time. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his tone carrying both warning and something unexpected, genuine curiosity. "I never thought it would be," Grace replied, watching him leave with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout their entire conversation. As the black car pulled away from the curb, Dante sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window, unusually thoughtful. He had underestimated her completely, assumed she would react exactly like every other small business owner he had pressured before. He pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number. "I need everything you can find about Grace Miller," he said firmly. "Her business, her family, her lawyer. Everything." Back inside the quiet bookstore, Grace finally allowed herself to breathe deeply, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation had ended. She had won this first argument, but she understood clearly that a man like Dante Russo would not simply walk away. She glanced around her grandfather's shop, memories flooding back of countless afternoons spent among these very shelves. "Whatever happens next," she whispered quietly to herself, "I'm not giving this up without a fight." Little did she know, this first small victory would soon draw her into a much larger, far more dangerous conflict than she could have ever imagined. 3 days passed, but Dante Russo could not shake the memory of that small bookstore confrontation. He had built his reputation on control, on people bending to his demands quickly and quietly. Grace Miller had done neither. He sat in his office on the 15th floor of a downtown building, staring at a thin folder his assistant had prepared. Marco, his second-in-command, stood nearby, waiting for instructions. "What did you find?" Dante asked, flipping open the folder. "Grace Miller, 29 years old," Marco reported. "Inherited the bookstore from her grandfather 3 years ago. Before that, she worked for 5 years at Caldwell & Associates, a corporate law firm downtown." Dante's eyebrows rose slightly. "A law firm?" "She wasn't a lawyer herself," Marco clarified. "Paralegal. But apparently very good at it. Her old supervisor said she had a sharp mind for contracts and property law specifically." Dante leaned back in his chair, understanding now why Grace had responded so confidently during their meeting. "That explains the least knowledge," he muttered. "There's more," Marco continued. "She left the firm suddenly after her grandfather passed away, taking over the bookstore. Some co-workers said she left because of a dispute with a senior partner, something involving unethical property deals the firm was pushing through. She reported it internally before resigning." Dante studied the folder carefully, a strange mixture of frustration and reluctant respect building inside him. Most people he pressured had no real understanding of the legal complexities protecting their businesses. Grace clearly did, and she had prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation long before he ever arrived. "She's dangerous," Dante said quietly, more to himself than to Marco. "Should we back off?" Marco asked carefully. Dante's expression hardened. "No. We adjust our approach." Meanwhile, at the bookstore, Grace sat quietly in the back office after closing hours, staring at old files spread across her desk. Her mind drifted back to memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Flashback. 4 years ago. Grace, then 25, sat nervously in a large conference room at Caldwell & Associates, reviewing property documents for a senior partner, Richard Caldwell himself. Something about the paperwork felt wrong immediately. "These signatures don't match the original documents," young Grace had said carefully, comparing 2 contracts side by side. "This looks like the property owner's signature was copied from an older agreement." Richard Caldwell had smiled coldly. "You're very observant, Grace. That's exactly why I like having you on my team." "Sir, if these documents are falsified, that's fraud," Grace had said, her voice trembling slightly despite her determination to speak up. "It's called business, Grace," Richard had replied smoothly. Sometimes elderly property owners need a little help understanding what's truly in their best interest. Grace had spent that entire night reviewing case files, discovering multiple similar situations where the firm had pressured elderly or vulnerable property owners into signing unfavorable agreements, sometimes using forged documents to speed up the process. She reported everything to the State Bar Association the following week, providing detailed evidence of the firm's unethical practices. Though Richard Caldwell managed to avoid serious legal consequences through expensive lawyers and quiet settlements, Grace found herself quickly pushed out of the firm, her position eliminated under the excuse of budget cuts. End of flashback. Grace closed the old file folder slowly, remembering the anger and helplessness she had felt watching a powerful man avoid consequences simply because he had enough money and influence to make problems disappear. She had promised herself then that she would never again stay silent while someone used intimidation and false paperwork to steal what rightfully belonged to someone else. Now, facing Dante Russo's clear intention to force her out of her grandfather's shop, that old promise burned brighter than ever inside her. The following afternoon, Dante returned to the bookstore, though this time he came alone, without his usual bodyguards trailing behind him. Grace looked up from restocking a shelf, unsurprised by his return. "Back so soon?" she asked evenly. "I did some research on you," Dante said, walking closer. "Caldwell and Associates. Interesting history." Grace's expression remained calm, though internally she felt a slight jolt of surprise. "Then you already know I understand exactly how these situations typically play out." "I do," Dante admitted, surprising her slightly with his honesty. "Which is why I'm here to offer you something different than what I originally proposed." "I'm listening," Grace said cautiously. "A partnership," Dante said. "Instead of buying you out completely, I renovate the building, modernize the block, and you keep your store here permanently, rent-free, in exchange for a small percentage of profits from the surrounding businesses I develop." Grace studied him carefully, searching for hidden motives behind this sudden change in approach. "Why the change of heart, Mr. Russo?" "Because forcing you out clearly isn't as simple as I expected," Dante said honestly. "And frankly, having someone with your legal knowledge on my side could prove far more valuable than having you as an enemy." Grace considered his offer carefully, though skepticism remained clear in her expression. "And if I refuse this partnership as well?" Dante's expression shifted slightly, something colder returning briefly to his eyes. "Then we go back to more traditional methods of negotiation, methods I would honestly prefer to avoid." Grace held his gaze steadily, the threat clear despite his diplomatic wording. "I need time to think about your offer." "Take all the time you need," Dante said, though his tone made clear that patience was not truly unlimited. "But Grace, understand this. I always get what I want eventually. The only question is how difficult that process becomes for everyone involved." As Dante left the store once again, Grace remained standing quietly among her grandfather's books, fully aware that whatever decision she made next would determine far more than just the future of her small bookstore. It would determine exactly how far Dante Russo was truly willing to go to get what he wanted. Grace did not sleep well that night. Dante's offer echoed in her mind, mixing with old memories of Richard Caldwell's smooth voice explaining away forged signatures. Something about the sudden partnership proposal felt too convenient, too calculated, like a chess move rather than genuine goodwill. The next morning, she called an old friend from her paralegal days, Priya, who now worked as a junior associate at a small but respected firm downtown. "I need a favor," Grace said, sitting in her back office with a cup of coffee cooling beside her. "Can you look into a name for me?" "Dante Russo. Property development, mostly around Maple Avenue and the surrounding blocks." "Give me a day," Priya said. "I'll see what public records show." True to her word, Priya called back the following afternoon, her voice tight with concern. "Grace, this doesn't look good. Russo has filed permits for a massive redevelopment project covering nearly the entire block. But here's the strange part. 3 of the surrounding property leases he claims to already control don't actually show any transfer of ownership in the city records. It's like he's telling everyone he owns buildings he hasn't actually purchased yet." Grace sat up straighter, her mind sharpening immediately. He's bluffing. Using pressure and intimidation to make business owners believe resistance is pointless, when really, he hasn't secured nearly as much control as he claims. "That would explain why he came back with a partnership offer instead of just forcing you out," Priya said. If his plan depends on convincing everyone he already has full control of the block, one business owner standing firm and asking questions publicly could unravel his entire strategy. Grace thanked her friend and hung up, her mind racing with this new information. Dante's confidence during their first meeting had been carefully performed, a bluff designed to make her surrender without ever checking the actual details behind his claims. That evening, Dante returned to the bookstore for Grace's answer, his usual confident smile firmly in place as he stepped through the door. "Have you considered my offer?" he asked smoothly. Grace stood behind the counter, arms crossed, her expression calm but sharp. "I have. And I have a few questions before I decide anything." "Of course," Dante said, though something in his posture shifted slightly, sensing the change in her tone. "You mentioned modernizing the entire block," Grace said carefully. "That would require you to already control most of the surrounding properties. Yet city records show no transfer of ownership for at least 3 of those buildings." Dante's smile faltered slightly. "Those deals are still being finalized." "Are they?" Grace asked, her voice steady. "Or are you telling every business owner on this street that you already control everything around them, hoping fear and assumption will make actual negotiation unnecessary?" The silence that followed confirmed everything Grace suspected. Dante's confident expression cracked slightly, replaced by something more careful, more calculating. "You've done your research," he said finally, his tone shifting. "I told you," Grace replied evenly. "I don't make decisions without understanding exactly what I'm dealing with." Dante studied her for a long moment, clearly recalculating his approach entirely. "Fine. I don't yet control every property on this block. But I will, eventually. Business owners like Mr. Delacroix and Mrs. Chen have already agreed to sell, pending final paperwork." "Have they?" Grace asked. "Or have they simply stopped resisting because they believed, like I almost did, that your control was already absolute?" Dante's jaw tightened, clearly unaccustomed to having his tactics exposed so directly and calmly. "What exactly are you suggesting, Grace?" "I'm suggesting," Grace said, stepping around the counter to stand directly in front of him, "that your entire redevelopment plan depends heavily on intimidation rather than actual legal ownership. And I'm suggesting that if business owners on this street start talking to each other, comparing notes, checking public records the way I just did, your plan could fall apart very quickly." Dante's expression darkened, the calm businessman mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "Careful, Grace. Threats work both ways." "That's not a threat," Grace said calmly, though her heart pounded steadily beneath her composed exterior. "That's simply an observation about how quickly public information can change a negotiation once people stop being afraid to look closely." For a tense moment, neither spoke, the small bookstore filled with quiet, dangerous tension. Finally, Dante stepped back slightly, forcing his expression back into something more controlled. "What do you want, Grace?" he asked directly. "Clearly, simple intimidation isn't going to work with you." "I want you to leave Maple Avenue alone," Grace said firmly. "Every business owner here built something real, something honest. You don't get to bully people out of what they've worked for simply because you have money and confidence." Dante studied her carefully, an unfamiliar mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration crossing his features. "And if I refuse to simply walk away?" "Then I start talking to every business owner on this street," Grace said steadily. "I show them exactly what I found in public records today. I help them understand their legal rights, the same way I understand mine. And I make sure your bluff collapses completely, publicly, before you manage to secure a single additional property." Dante's eyes narrowed, clearly recognizing the very real threat behind Grace's calm words. This was not simple defiance anymore. This was strategic, calculated resistance from someone who genuinely understood how to dismantle his entire plan. "You would risk making a powerful enemy," Dante said quietly, though the warning carried less confidence than his previous threats. "I already have one," Grace replied evenly. "The question now is whether you want an enemy who simply resists, or one who actively works to expose exactly how your entire operation actually functions." Dante remained silent for a long moment, clearly reassessing the situation entirely. Whatever he had expected from this confrontation, losing control of the narrative so completely had not been part of his calculations. "This conversation isn't finished," he said finally, turning toward the door. "I never expected it to be," Grace replied, watching him leave with the same steady calm she had maintained throughout their entire exchange. As his car pulled away from the curb once again, Grace allowed herself a small, satisfied breath. She had exposed his bluff, shifted the balance of power significantly in her favor. But she also understood clearly that a man like Dante Russo, having lost control of a situation once, would not simply walk away quietly. He would come back, likely with a far more dangerous strategy than intimidation alone. Dante did not return to the bookstore that week. Grace noticed the silence immediately, and instead of feeling relieved, she felt more uneasy than ever. Men like Dante Russo did not simply disappear after losing an argument. They regrouped. She decided not to wait passively for his next move. The following morning, she visited Mr. Delacroix, an elderly man who ran a small tailor shop 2 doors down from her bookstore. "Mr. Delacroix," Grace said gently, stepping into his quiet shop filled with the smell of fabric and old wood. "I wanted to ask you something about Dante Russo." The old man's hands paused over the sewing machine, his expression tightening slightly at the name. "What about him? Did you actually sign anything yet?" Grace asked carefully. "Any paperwork transferring ownership of your shop?" Mr. Delacroix shook his head slowly. "Not yet. His men came by twice, said it was already decided, that everyone else on the street had already agreed. Said resisting would only make things harder for me." Grace felt a familiar anger rising inside her chest. "That's not true, Mr. Delacroix. I checked the public records myself. He doesn't own any of these buildings yet. He's using pressure and false claims to make everyone believe resistance is pointless." The old man's eyes widened slightly, relief and anger mixing across his weathered face. "I suspected something wasn't right, but I didn't know how to check for myself." "You're not alone in this," Grace said firmly. "None of us are, as long as we stand together instead of believing his bluff separately." Over the next 2 days, Grace visited every remaining business owner on Maple Avenue, sharing what she had discovered, helping each of them understand their actual legal standing. Slowly, a quiet but powerful alliance began forming among shop owners who had once felt completely alone and powerless against Dante's intimidation. Word of this growing resistance eventually reached Dante through Marco, who delivered the news with visible unease. "They're organizing," Marco reported. "Delacroix, Chen, 3 others. Grace has been going door to door, showing them the property records, explaining their legal rights." Dante's fist clenched tightly against his desk. "She's turning my entire strategy against me. What do you want to do?" Marco asked carefully. Dante sat quietly for a long moment, his mind working through several options, none of them particularly appealing. Traditional intimidation had already failed once against Grace. Escalating to genuine violence carried serious risk, especially now that multiple business owners were aware of the situation and potentially documenting everything carefully. "Set up a meeting," Dante said finally. "All of them, Grace included. Tomorrow evening, here in my office." "You think they'll actually come?" Marco asked skeptically. "They will," Dante said confidently. "Because Grace will insist on it, believing she can negotiate a fair resolution for everyone. She's confident, but she's not reckless. A public meeting, on record, benefits her position just as much as it benefits mine, if handled correctly." The next evening, Grace arrived at Dante's downtown office building, accompanied by Mr. Delacroix, Mrs. Chen, and 2 other business owners from Maple Avenue. The atmosphere in the elevator ride up to the 15th floor was tense, nervous energy radiating from everyone except Grace, who remained outwardly composed despite her own racing heartbeat. Dante waited for them in a large conference room, Marco standing beside him, both men projecting confidence despite the shifted balance of power in the room. "Thank you all for coming," Dante said smoothly, gesturing toward the empty chairs around the table. "I believe it's time we resolved this situation clearly, for everyone's benefit." "We're listening," Grace said evenly, taking a seat directly across from him. Dante leaned forward slightly. "I'll be honest. My original plan involved acquiring the entire block quickly, using confidence and urgency to speed up negotiations. I underestimated how quickly Grace would see through that approach." Several of the business owners exchanged surprised glances at his sudden honesty. "However," Dante continued, My interest in developing this area remains genuine. I still believe modernizing Maple Avenue could benefit everyone here, increasing foot traffic, property values, and long-term business opportunities. At what cost? Mrs. Chen asked cautiously. That depends entirely on how we structure this moving forward, Dante said, glancing briefly at Grace. I'm prepared to offer legitimate, fair contracts, individually negotiated with each business owner, with full transparency and legal representation present for every signing, if that would restore your trust. Grace studied him carefully, searching for any hidden manipulation behind his sudden change in approach. And if we refuse any development entirely, preferring to keep the block exactly as it currently stands? Dante's expression tightened slightly, clearly not the answer he hoped to hear, but he nodded slowly nonetheless. Then I would need to respect that decision, difficult as it might be for my own business interests. The room fell silent for a moment, everyone processing this unexpected shift from intimidation toward genuine negotiation. I have a suggestion, Grace said finally, breaking the silence. Instead of complete refusal or complete surrender, what if we approach this as an actual community negotiation? Each business owner reviews your development proposal individually, with their own legal representation. Nobody signs anything under pressure or false claims about what others have already agreed to. And critically, any renovation respects the historical character of these buildings, rather than simply replacing everything with generic modern development. Dante considered her proposal carefully, clearly recognizing that this approach, while more complicated and time-consuming than his original plan, offered a realistic path forward without further public embarrassment or legal complications. That seems reasonable, Dante admitted, somewhat reluctantly. Around the table, the other business owners nodded slowly, cautious optimism replacing their earlier nervous tension. We'll need everything in writing, Grace said firmly. Clear timelines, transparent terms, and no more claims about deals that haven't actually been finalized. Agreed, Dante said, extending his hand across the table toward Grace. Grace studied his hand for a moment before shaking it firmly, though her expression remained cautiously guarded rather than fully trusting. As the meeting concluded and everyone began gathering their things, Dante caught Grace's attention one final time. You could have simply taken my original partnership offer, he said quietly. Kept your store safe, avoided all of this conflict entirely. But everyone else on this street would have lost everything, Grace replied simply. That was never a choice I was willing to make just to protect myself. Dante studied her thoughtfully, something resembling genuine respect finally settling into his expression. You're an unusual woman, Grace Miller. I've been told that before, Grace replied evenly, turning to leave with the other business owners, unaware that this fragile agreement would soon be tested by forces neither of them had anticipated. 2 weeks passed, and to everyone's cautious surprise, Dante actually followed through on his promise. Individual meetings were scheduled with each business owner, lawyers present, terms clearly written and explained before anyone signed anything. Grace attended several of these meetings personally, helping her neighbors understand contract details they might otherwise have missed. For the first time in months, Maple Avenue felt calm. Mr. Delacroix even mentioned that Dante's proposed renovation plans, once properly explained without pressure or urgency, actually included reasonable improvements, better lighting, repaired sidewalks, updated plumbing, without demanding anyone give up ownership or control of their shops. But not everyone was pleased with this peaceful resolution. Inside Dante's own organization, whispers of dissatisfaction began spreading quietly. Several of his senior associates, men who had built their reputations on aggressive tactics and quick, forceful acquisitions, grew increasingly uncomfortable watching their boss negotiate so carefully with a group of small business owners. One evening, Marco approached Dante privately in his office, his expression troubled. "Boss, some of the others are talking," Marco said carefully. "Vincent, Carlo, a few of the senior guys. They think you're going soft, letting one woman completely change how you do business." Dante looked up from his desk, unsurprised by the news. "Let them talk." "It's more than talk," Marco warned. "Vincent mentioned bringing this up with the larger council. Said your handling of the Maple Avenue situation makes the whole organization look weak, especially after word spread about Grace exposing your bluff so publicly." Dante's jaw tightened slightly, understanding immediately the deeper danger hidden within Marco's warning. In his world, reputation was not simply about pride. It was about survival. If rivals or even his own associates began perceiving him as weak, other, more dangerous predators would eventually try to take advantage of that perceived vulnerability. "Set up a meeting with Vincent," Dante said finally. "I'll handle this directly." Meanwhile, Grace remained unaware of the growing tension within Dante's organization, focused instead on ensuring every business owner on Maple Avenue understood their new contracts thoroughly. She sat in her back office late one evening, reviewing paperwork for Mrs. Chen's tea shop renovation, when Priya called unexpectedly. "Grace, I think you should know something," Priya said, her voice tense. "I heard through a contact at the courthouse that there's tension brewing within Russo's own organization. Some of his people aren't happy about how he handled your situation." Grace paused, setting down her paperwork carefully. "What kind of tension?" "The kind that sometimes leads to internal power struggles," Priya said carefully. "If people around him start viewing him as weak, Grace, it could actually make your situation more dangerous, not less. Desperate men trying to prove strength sometimes act more recklessly than confident ones." Grace absorbed this information quietly, understanding immediately the complicated reality of what she had accomplished. She had successfully protected Maple Avenue through intelligence and calm negotiation rather than fear, but in doing so, she had potentially placed Dante himself in a precarious position within his own dangerous world. "Thank you for telling me," Grace said finally. "I need to think about what this means." The following afternoon, Dante met privately with Vincent, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes who had worked alongside Dante's late father years earlier, long before Dante himself took control of the organization. "You've gone soft," Vincent said bluntly, settling into a chair across from Dante's desk without waiting for an invitation. "Word is spreading, Dante. A bookstore owner outsmarted you, and instead of correcting that embarrassment, you rewarded her by giving her exactly what she wanted." "I made a strategic decision," Dante replied evenly, refusing to show the irritation building beneath his calm exterior. "One that avoided unnecessary legal exposure and public scrutiny." "Strategic decisions don't make the council nervous," Vincent said sharply. "This does. People are starting to wonder if you're truly capable of running this organization the way your father once did." Dante studied Vincent carefully, recognizing clearly the underlying threat hidden within his blunt words. Vincent was not simply expressing personal disappointment. He was testing the waters, likely on behalf of others within the council who might be considering whether Dante's leadership remained secure. "Careful, Vincent," Dante said quietly, his tone hardening slightly despite his controlled expression. "Questioning my methods is one thing. Questioning my authority is something else entirely." Vincent held his gaze for a long moment before finally looking away slightly, though his expression remained unconvinced. "The council meets next week. I'd suggest having a better explanation ready than simple strategy, Dante. Otherwise, people might start looking for stronger leadership elsewhere." After Vincent left, Dante sat alone in his office, the weight of the situation settling heavily upon him. He had genuinely believed his negotiated agreement with Grace and the other business owners represented smart, sustainable business practice. But within his world, patience and fairness were often mistaken for weakness, dangerous vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited by those seeking greater power. That evening, unexpectedly, Grace appeared at Dante's office building, having decided she needed to understand exactly what consequences her victory might have created for him. "I heard there's trouble within your organization," Grace said directly, once Marco allowed her into Dante's office. "Because of what happened between us." Dante studied her carefully, surprised by her direct concern. "That's not something you need to worry about, Grace." "Actually, I think it is," Grace replied firmly. "If your position becomes unstable because of our agreement, it could put everything we negotiated at risk, along with putting you personally in danger." Dante leaned back in his chair, genuinely surprised by her willingness to consider his situation despite everything that had happened between them. "Why would that concern you?" "Because despite everything," Grace said carefully, "you actually kept your word. You followed through fairly, honestly, when you could have easily found ways around our agreement." "That matters to me, Dante." For a long moment, neither spoke, an unfamiliar understanding passing quietly between two people who had begun as adversaries but now found themselves unexpectedly connected through mutual respect. "What do you suggest?" Dante finally asked. Grace considered carefully before answering. "Let me speak to your counsel directly." Show them exactly why this agreement protects everyone's interests, including the organization's long-term reputation and legal safety. Sometimes people simply need clear, logical explanation rather than assumptions about weakness. Dante studied her proposal, recognizing both the risk and the potential strength behind her suggestion. Allowing Grace, an outsider, to address his own counsel was unconventional, potentially dangerous, yet undeniably bold. "That's a significant risk," Dante said slowly. "So was standing up to you in the first place," Grace replied evenly. "But sometimes the right choice isn't necessarily the safest one." Dante studied her for a long moment, something resembling genuine admiration mixing with cautious uncertainty in his expression. "All right," he said finally. "Next week's council meeting. You'll get your chance to speak." Neither of them fully understood yet just how dramatically that single meeting would reshape everything that followed. The council meeting was set for the following Tuesday evening, held in a private room on the top floor of an old, respected building downtown, one that had housed the organization's most important gatherings for decades. Grace arrived early, dressed simply but professionally, carrying a folder of documents she had prepared carefully over the past several days. Dante met her outside the meeting room, his expression tense despite his usual composed demeanor. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly. "I am," Grace said firmly, though her heart pounded steadily beneath her calm exterior. "Trust me." Inside the room, a long table stretched across the space, occupied by 8 men, including Vincent, all watching Grace's entrance with sharp, curious eyes. This was clearly not a room that welcomed outsiders easily, especially not a young woman who had already caused significant disruption within their organization's usual methods. "This is highly unusual, Dante," an older man at the head of the table said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Explain why we're allowing this meeting to happen at all." "Because Grace Miller understands exactly why my approach with Maple Avenue protects this organization rather than weakening it," Dante replied evenly. "I think it's worth hearing her explanation directly." Grace stepped forward, placing her folder on the table, opening it calmly despite the intense scrutiny surrounding her. "Gentlemen, I understand there are concerns about how this situation was handled. Let me explain clearly why negotiation, rather than intimidation, actually protected everyone's long-term interests here." She pulled out several documents, spreading them carefully across the table. These are public records showing 3 separate lawsuits filed against similar organizations over the past 5 years, each involving forced property acquisitions through intimidation tactics. Every single case resulted in significant financial penalties, increased police attention, and permanent damage to the organization's ability to operate quietly within their communities. The room fell silent, several council members leaning forward slightly to examine the documents more closely. "Maple Avenue's business owners were prepared to fight this publicly," Grace continued firmly. "Multiple witnesses, documented evidence of false claims about property ownership, recorded conversations. If this situation had escalated through intimidation rather than fair negotiation, it would have created exactly the kind of public exposure and legal vulnerability your organization has clearly worked hard to avoid in other cases." Vincent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, though he remained silent, listening carefully despite his obvious skepticism. "Instead," Grace said, "Dante's decision to negotiate fairly resulted in signed contracts, legitimate legal protection for all parties involved, positive community relationships, and zero legal exposure or public scandal. The renovation project moves forward exactly as planned, with full cooperation instead of resistance." The older man at the head of the table studied Grace carefully, clearly reassessing his initial skepticism. "You're suggesting his approach wasn't weakness, but rather smarter long-term strategy." "Exactly," Grace confirmed. "Intimidation might work quickly in the short term, but it creates lasting vulnerabilities. Fair negotiation, while slower, builds sustainable trust and protection that benefits everyone involved, including this organization's ability to continue operating without unwanted attention." Silence settled over the room as council members exchanged thoughtful glances, clearly reconsidering their earlier assumptions about Dante's handling of the situation. Finally, the older man spoke again. "And you, Miss Miller, why exactly are you helping Dante's position within his own organization after everything that happened between you?" Grace considered the question carefully before answering honestly. "Because he kept his word, even when it would have been easier not to. In my experience, that kind of integrity is rare, and worth protecting, regardless of which side of the negotiation table someone sits on. The room remained quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words settling clearly among the gathered men. "Thank you, Miss Miller," the older man said finally. "You may wait outside while we discuss this further." Grace nodded, gathering her documents calmly before stepping outside, leaving Dante alone to face his counsel's final judgment. Nearly 30 minutes passed before Dante finally emerged from the meeting room, his expression unreadable as he approached Grace, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway. "Well?" Grace asked, unable to hide her own nervous tension any longer. A slow, genuine smile spread across Dante's face. "They agreed. My position remains secure. In fact, Vincent himself admitted your explanation changed his perspective entirely on how this organization should approach future negotiations." Grace released a breath of relief. "I'm glad." "You didn't have to do that," Dante said quietly, studying her carefully. "Risk yourself, walk into a room full of dangerous men, defend my position after everything I put you and your neighbors through." "I told you," Grace replied evenly. "I don't make decisions based on fear, Dante. I make them based on what's right." Dante studied her for a long moment, genuine respect clear in his expression now, replacing whatever calculating businessman mask he usually wore so carefully. "You're an extraordinary woman, Grace Miller." "So I've been told," Grace said, a small smile finally breaking through her own composed exterior. Months later, Maple Avenue looked different, though its essential character remained beautifully intact. Freshly painted storefronts, updated lighting, repaired sidewalks, improvements that enhanced rather than erased the neighborhood's original charm. Every business owner remained exactly where they belonged, secure in fair, transparent contracts that protected their interests permanently. Grace's bookstore thrived more than ever, now benefiting from increased foot traffic brought by the neighborhood's careful revitalization. She stood behind her counter one quiet afternoon, arranging a new shipment of books, when the familiar bell above her door rang softly. Dante stepped inside, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him before, without his usual entourage of bodyguards trailing behind. "Just checking on my investment," he said, a genuine smile playing at his lips. Grace laughed softly, shaking her head. "Somehow, I don't think that's the only reason you're here." "Maybe not," Dante admitted, glancing around the cozy, familiar shop. "I've learned a lot from you, Grace. About strength, about how real power doesn't always require fear or force." "And I've learned," Grace replied thoughtfully, "that sometimes even the most intimidating people are capable of genuine change, if given the right reason to choose it." Dante nodded slowly, appreciation clear in his expression. "Thank you, Grace, for refusing to surrender that first day, and for everything that followed because of it." "Thank you," Grace replied sincerely, "for eventually choosing to listen." Outside, Maple Avenue buzzed quietly with life, entirely unaware of how close its future had once come to being decided through fear and intimidation rather than fairness and genuine understanding. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won through force or fear, but through quiet, unwavering courage, sharp intelligence, and the simple refusal to back down from what's right.